Are you ready for a story of forgiveness and transformation? Follow Ethan's journey, a man who lost his brother tragically and watched his life fall apart. But instead of being consumed by anger, he found a surprising way to free himself and rediscover peace. This inspiring story will touch your heart and show that, even in the hardest moments, rebirth is possible. Click play and be inspired by this powerful message. Ethan was a 40-year-old man, calm and dedicated to his family and work. He and his younger brother, Michael, were very close. The age difference between them seemed to disappear when they were together, sharing laughs and special moments that reinforced their family bond. Michael was admired by everyone in the community. Charismatic, involved in social projects, and always willing to help, he brought joy and hope to many. But everything changed on a tragic night. Michael was the victim of an act of violence that took his life in a brutal way. The devastating news shook the family and the entire community. For Ethan, in particular, it felt as though his world had collapsed. The pain of losing his beloved brother was indescribable. He mentally relived every moment they had spent together, which only increased the void and resentment he felt. During the trial, Ethan had the opportunity to see the man responsible for Michael's death, a young man of 25. The defendant showed remorse, but Ethan was consumed by deep anger. He couldn't accept the apology or feel any compassion. All he could think about was his desire for justice, that the person responsible should pay for what he had done. The pain and resentment began to consume Ethan completely. He felt increasingly lost, unable to accept the idea that his brother was no longer by his side. The trial had provided some answers but no peace. Ethan couldn't imagine how he would move forward with so much anger in his heart. The days following the trial were filled with intense, unrelenting pain for Ethan. He began to realize that the anger and resentment were taking over his life. Thinking of Michael made him relive the tragedy, and the sadness transformed into a bitterness he couldn't control. Over time, this bitterness began to affect his relationship with his wife and children. Ethan emotionally distanced himself from his family, trapped in a cycle of suffering and anger. This burden did not only affect his emotional life, his physical health began to deteriorate as well. Ethan suffered from constant headaches and fatigue, barely able to sleep, and when he did, he was haunted by nightmares of losing his brother. He avoided going out and withdrew from friends, attempting to deal with the pain alone but feeling increasingly isolated and purposeless. One sleepless night, an old friend, Tom, visited him. Worried about Ethan's state, Tom tried to remind him of the importance of moving forward and suggested that perhaps the path to peace was through forgiveness. The word forgiveness sounded absurd to Ethan. How could he forgive someone who had caused him so much suffering? He was convinced that forgiveness would be a betrayal of Michael's memory. But Tom persisted, speaking of the possibility of releasing himself from the burden of anger. Ethan, the resentment you're holding onto is hurting you, not him. Perhaps forgiveness is more about freeing yourself than freeing him. These words struck a chord in Ethan, although he still resisted the idea. He didn't know if he was capable of forgiving, but he began to consider that maybe it was the only way to find some relief. After talking with Tom, Ethan decided to seek support to understand if forgiveness could really bring peace. He began by visiting a small church in his neighborhood, where he spoke with the spiritual leader, a wise and serene man named Pastor James. Upon hearing Ethan's story, the pastor spoke of the complexity of forgiveness, explaining that forgiving didn't mean forgetting what had happened but rather releasing one's own soul from the prison of resentment. The pastor's words made him reflect, and Ethan decided to open himself to the possibility, even though the idea still seemed distant. Ethan began to attend church regularly, seeking comfort in his faith and guidance on how to deal with his feelings. In one of these meetings, the pastor suggested that Ethan join a support group composed of people who had also lost loved ones to violence. Reluctant at first, Ethan decided to try, believing that perhaps he could find other stories that would help him better understand his own pain. In the support group, he met people with similar stories of loss and suffering. Each meeting brought a new perspective, and by listening to others' experiences, Ethan began to see that many there faced the same dilemma, the desire for revenge versus the need for peace. Some members had already found a way forward through forgiveness, and these stories deeply impacted him. He began to understand that forgiveness wasn't something that happened overnight but a decision that had to be renewed daily. However, the internal struggle was constant. Ethan thought of Michael every day, of their conversations, laughter, and the plans they had made. Each memory brought a deep pain, and resentment still seemed like a natural response. Even so, something inside him began to change. He realized that forgiveness didn't mean abandoning justice but choosing not to be consumed by hatred. The meetings and conversations with the support group made Ethan feel stronger and closer to the idea of freeing his heart from the burden he carried. He was far from feeling at peace, but for the first time, he saw a possibility of reconciling with his brother's memory without letting hatred dominate him. Each small victory in this journey was celebrated with his friends from the group, and Ethan began to see that the path of forgiveness was, indeed, possible. After months of reflection and support, Ethan made the hardest decision of his life, to visit his brother's killer in prison. The idea terrified him, but he felt that he needed to confront the man who had taken Michael's life in order to perhaps find some form of closure. With a heavy heart and a mix of fear and nervousness, he prepared for the encounter. Upon arriving at the prison, Ethan was led to a small, cold room where he waited for the moment when his brother's killer would be brought in. Sitting there, he took deep breaths, trying to control his emotions. He wondered if he truly had the strength to do what he had set out to do. After all, he was about to face the person responsible for the greatest pain of his life. When the young man entered the room, Ethan observed him in silence. The man before him looked vulnerable, with slouched shoulders and downcast eyes, showing deep shame. Ethan had expected to feel rage, but at that moment, the fury that had accompanied him for so long was replaced by a strange serenity. He no longer saw a monster but a human being who also seemed devastated by the consequences of his actions. After a moment of silence, the young man began to speak, expressing his remorse in a trembling voice. He spoke of the sleepless nights filled with guilt and the weight he had carried since the crime. He wasn't asking for forgiveness expecting it to be granted, but because he felt he needed to take responsibility for the irreversible harm he had caused. His words deeply moved Ethan, and he sensed the sincerity in the young man's regret. In an act that surprised even himself, Ethan reached out to the young man. With a trembling voice, he said it hadn't been easy for him to be there, but he had decided to forgive him. This forgiveness would not erase the pain of losing Michael, but for Ethan, it was the only way to move forward. In offering forgiveness, he felt a huge weight lift from his heart. It was as if, for the first time in years, he could breathe freely. The meeting ended with Ethan feeling an unexpected peace, a lightness he hadn't known in a long time. Leaving the prison, he felt that, in some way, he had taken a crucial step in honoring his brother's memory. The decision to forgive was painful, but in doing so, he finally found the peace he had been searching for. After that encounter, Ethan's life began to change profoundly. The peace he found by forgiving his brother's killer brought him a new perspective. He began to value every moment with his family and reconnected with his wife and children. Ethan rediscovered joy in small things, like family dinners and his children's smiles. Forgiveness had freed his soul and restored his ability to love fully. Over time, Ethan decided to use his experience to help others. He began to participate in support groups, sharing his story with those who also carried the weight of resentment and pain. His journey became an inspiration, and he began to encourage others to consider forgiveness as a path to finding peace. In each story he heard and each person he supported, Ethan saw an opportunity to honor Michael's memory in a positive way. What once seemed impossible was now a new mission in life. Ethan had transformed his pain into purpose, dedicating himself to helping others overcome their own emotional battles. He knew that forgiveness was not an easy path, but it was the only one that brought true peace. In this way, Ethan not only changed his own life but also became part of the transformation of many others. Reflecting on his journey, Ethan felt deep gratitude for the peace he had finally found. He knew that forgiveness didn't change the past, but it transformed the present. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, he often said, but it is the act of freeing the soul and making room for healing. Ethan understood that, in forgiving, he honored Michael's memory in a way he had never imagined. He learned that forgiveness was an act of courage, and in choosing this path, he found true peace and renewed his own life. His message to everyone was clear: no matter how difficult it is, forgiveness can be the path to inner freedom. With each new day, Ethan carried with him the certainty that forgiveness was one of the most powerful forces anyone could find. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Your support helps spread this message of forgiveness and hope to more people. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Let's share the power of forgiveness together.